My name is Mohamed Huque, and I'm the Director of Community Impact at Toronto Foundation, and help lead our research agenda, which includes the Toronto's Vital Signs Report. I'm joined today with Steve Ayer, our lead researcher and author of the report, to talk about the findings. But first, we want to thank you again for joining us for this session, which is kicking off our 2024 annual learning program for fund holders and the wider community. We launched the report in person last fall. I think we had about 200 people show up at 8 a.m. at the Toronto Reference Library to hear the findings. And so we recognize there's really this great interest in wanting to convene another public briefing for those who were not able to attend that event. And in this format, we'll be able to go a little deeper into the research. I also want to first begin by sharing a little story about me. I'm a first-generation Canadian and grew up in Toronto most of my life. But it was actually only in my early 20s that I first had a real exchange with someone who was Indigenous. I think I must have been 20, 21 years old, working part-time at a call center, when the person seated next to me mentioned that he has a status card. Now, I'm a product of the Ontario school system in the 90s, which means I was woefully unprepared for that conversation. And my knowledge of Indigenous peoples was incredibly shallow, probably filled with lots of misinformation, and very much rooted in history. And so I was fascinated to meet this person who was my age, but connected to this land in a far deeper way. And I think many of us have this moment when we're confronted with the reality that we are either settlers or descendants of settlers, and that we have an obligation to this place we now call home and the original inhabitants. And so this requires learning from and building with Indigenous communities. And so I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And today, the meeting place of Tekaronto is still home to at least 70,000 diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. We're also governed by Treaty 13, known as the Toronto Purchase, that was established between the Crown and the Mississaugas more than 200 years ago. I'm grateful to be in this place and have the opportunity to work, live, connect, and learn with so many of you today. So today, we're together because you want to better understand the findings of our latest Toronto's Vital Signs report. It's actually our 19th TVS report. And what's amazing is that throughout these past 2 decades, we've mostly maintained the same structure, a view into the quality of life in the city across 10 standard issue areas. And this allows us to compare the findings over time. And several years ago, we also began taking an equity lens to the report, which meant we zoomed in on parts of the city and population groups that were disproportionately impacted by the trends we were surfacing. Now, this brings us to the 2023 report, which maintained that same structure of 10 chapters covering the same thematic areas of housing and work, environment, and so on. And it remains comprehensive. I think we cited almost 200 research sources. We dug into dozens of data sets. And we also interviewed more than 40 community leaders, and their voices are embedded throughout the report. There are some notable differences, though. In recent years, I think people have come to associate our TVS report with gloomy stats and feelings of despair. And while we can't necessarily change the reality of what's happening in our city, we can take a different frame to the challenges and presented what I think is probably one of our most actionable reports ever. Some of you may recall back in 2022, we partnered with more than a dozen organizations across the city to conduct a study of social capital in Toronto. And in that report, we looked at our social connections, networks, trust, neighborhood support. And those findings resonated so deeply with us that it's actually shaped much of the work we've done since then. So we decided to apply that same social capital lens to the 2023 Vital Signs report, focusing on our shared predicament and put social connections, mental health, and the state of our public realm at the core of every chapter. And that's the lens through which we looked at the prevailing issues of our city, like sky-high unaffordability, or the abysmal mental health, and the crises that surround us. So with that, I'm going to now invite our lead researcher, Steve, to walk us through some of the key findings. His presentation will be about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to hear from all of you and any questions you may have. Now, bear in mind, we're going to try our best to capture the highlights of almost a 200-page report in about 25 minutes. So I encourage you all afterwards to spend some time with the report on your own. There's lots that we simply can't cover today. Steve.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So today I'm going to walk you through the findings of our Vital Signs report. As Mohammed mentioned, in each case, we're going through a lot of different content. So I highly recommend, in particular, if there's certain points that you're interested in, We will be referring to, when I can, the points that you can find the same information in the report. In this version of the presentation, I've updated numbers where they're available to tell the most recent side of the story. So sometimes numbers might be slightly different, and that is reflecting the fact that we do try to get you numbers that in some cases are updated just weeks ago to complement the information that we had earlier in the report. So next slide, please. One of the biggest findings we highlighted in our report that really served as a frame for a lot of the work was just the sheer level of loneliness we found in the city. When we asked folks how often they felt lonely, uh, it was quite striking that more than a third of folks in the city of Toronto reported feeling lonely at least 3 days in the past week in 2023, a trend that really persisted from earlier in the pandemic. And when we compared it to the rest of the country, it really was one of the highest places on the entire country in terms of loneliness. And we'll talk a lot about throughout this presentation about some of the reasons why Toronto was so particularly vulnerable to loneliness during the pandemic. But it really starts from such a striking point when we talk about the power of us is we started from a spot where people were feeling very disconnected. And when we look at more broadly at folks who are feeling lonely at least some of the time, and maybe two-thirds of folks were reporting they felt lonely at least some of the time in the last week, into 2023. Next slide, please. And a big part of this is declining social networks. And this trend we saw even before the pandemic. We look back at data from 2013, we looked at data from 2018 and 2022 of how many folks had close friends. And we can see that number dropping almost in half, for example, for the number of with 6 or more close friends. We see that there's much fewer folks with 6 or more close relatives. When we look at, do people know their neighbors? Do they feel they have a sense of belonging to our community? Do they feel like they have a high number of acquaintances? In each case, we see that over the last decade, fewer and fewer people were reporting they had these sorts of close relationships, and people are resulting in saying that they have less people to rely on and that their social networks have gotten a lot smaller. And a big part of this, too, was we are seeing this already pretty drastically changing in the 5 years before COVID. And COVID obviously took this scenario, which was already facing so many different challenges, and made it even more challenging. And of course, one of the obvious things is what are people doing with their time? And even before the pandemic, we saw the rise of social media. We saw the rise of internet streaming. We saw so many different changes in technology that enabled people to spend more time by themselves and less time out in their community, less time connecting with friends in person, and less times with deeper relationships. And all of those challenges only were made more challenging when we were all told to stay home, and really we used technology even more to use that as the primary vehicle by which we were connecting during the pandemic. Next slide, please. One of the things that we were quite struck by looking at our results was the rate of depression and the rate of anxiety disorders. And we looked at pretty severe levels of symptoms, like looking at things that if you were to go and present these symptoms at a doctor's office, you would be, diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, or if you had symptoms consistent with a general anxiety disorder. So about a quarter of adults reported symptoms that would be consistent with a major depressive disorder in 2023. Almost the same, 1 in 5 adults reported symptoms of moderate anxiety. And these are, pretty severe levels. I mean, these are things that you shouldn't be seeing a quarter of the population reporting levels of depression this severe. And when we look at some of the data that we had in Canada-wide before the pandemic, I mean, it would be about each of these indicators would be about a third of where they are now. And where we found this was so particularly striking is this was in 2023, mid 2023. Restrictions had loosened. People were able to go back into participating activities. So many of the things that kept people indoors had been gone away for quite an extensive period of time, but really saw almost no evidence that these symptoms of severe mental health conditions were improving at all over the course of the pandemic. And when we look more recent data, again, we still see very little evidence in terms of the most significant and severe consequences drastically improving, even as we go into 2024. And I think this is a big part of when we talk about the power of us is a lot of these mental health challenges do sometimes stem from a sense of disconnection and isolation. And of course, trying to make significant progress in them does require starting from a point of how do we get people reconnected and re-engaged. Next slide, please. And one of the things we looked at in our learning chapters, particularly there were very striking challenges for young adults, there for young people, and we looked at some of the data showing how students are doing, and it's a pretty emblematic example of some of the challenge we've seen. So the Toronto District School Board surveys a significant amount of their students on a relatively regular basis, and we see particularly for the older students in high school in the blue bar on the left. Happiness improved slightly in their most recent results in 2023, but they're still down pretty substantially from earlier in the before the pandemic. So, like happiness has started to rebound a little bit for some of the older students. For some of the younger students in grade 7 and 8, though there were some changes in the methodology, this should be interpreted with caution. We see a larger rebound in terms of happiness. So we certainly saw, particularly for people who remain in high school or folks who might be entering into high school, there's still some really significant challenges around mental health that are showing the slightest signs of improvement, but really are nowhere near where we might want them to be. And even when we look back 2016, 2017, that was already a significant rise from years earlier. One thing we did see was really positive for youth and young adults, and particularly around students, is the shift from virtual schooling to going in person was resulting with a pretty significant decline in loneliness and self-reported loneliness. So certainly that was a really positive sign, and potentially that was a major contributor to why mental health did improve slightly, in particular in this audience, even when we aren't necessarily seeing those sorts of significant improvements in the broader population. And in terms of other factors, particularly around students that we were concerned about, is school enjoyment has really taken a substantial decline during the pandemic and really not even shown no signs of improvement. It has declined even further, even though folks are back in school, which really I think does speak to a lot of long-term risks in terms of we do see a lot of learning loss. And the question we must ask ourselves is like, how are we going to get folks back? And if students are not enjoying school, and we see a really substantial drop during the pandemic, and again, further on. How are we going to get them re-engaged? How are we going to reverse some of the learning loss that we have seen over the course of the pandemic? Next slide, please. In our civic engagement, as well as in our chapters focusing on arts and culture, like it was really clear that one of the things that was going down over the course of the pandemic and really didn't rebound anywhere near as much as I think we all hoped was a lot of things around group participation, community engagement. We see that participation in groups and activities is down by about 30% when we look from 2018 2022. When we look at the stats we do have around things like library usage or recreational sports usage from the city, like we really see very little progress over the last year. So like things are down about 30-40% in a lot of different indicators about participating in community. And I think what particularly challenging around that is the fact that these are combined with population growth. So participation might be down 30-40%, but as we talk about later on, like the population of Toronto has grown pretty substantially during the pandemic. There's been a lot of folks moving into the city, particularly in the last years. And so when we see any of these sorts of declines in an absolute basis, when you consider the city of Toronto might have grown by 10 percentage points, maybe more, maybe a little bit less, but somewhere in that range, it really speaks to how much lower the typical person is participating in these sorts of programs. On the flip side, when we looked at 2022, those folks who had remained engaged in community did have better outcomes from everything from the number of friends they had to the amount of isolation they felt to their overall mental health. And that's really hard to separate one effect from the other. But we did see like when people remained in community, when they remained connected to activities that they loved and participated, it was associated with better mental health. And we'll pick that theme up again a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. And when we look at our income and wealth side of things, I mean, I think everyone is well aware from their own finances some of the challenges that come up, particularly as inflation surge. When we look at it from a population level, we can start to see what some of the challenges have been. I mean, in 2018, when we asked folks, was their income enough for you? Only 21% of folks said that their income was not enough for them. In 2022, as inflation just started to go up and some of our early COVID benefits started to go away, we saw that bump up to 26%. And then in the most recent survey, we saw that go up to 33%. So I mean, a 12% increase in the percentage of folks saying their income is not enough for them. I mean, that translates to hundreds of thousands of people across the city. And of course, when you think about hundreds of thousands more people saying their income is not enough for them to make ends meet. The next chart in the middle, where we talk about food bank usage, should come as no surprise. We see that the typical food bank usage on a typical month for the Daily Bread food bank in Toronto was about 68,000 people in 2019, up to about 267,000 people in the most recent year. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of percentage points increase in the number of folks using every month. And that chart on the left, I think, really explains some of why that's we're seeing that is there's a lot more folks who just can't meet their most essential needs. And inflation, both in terms of food, but also other essential costs, have played major roles in that. And as we talk about the power of us, I mean, I think it's really also worth highlighting that one of the things that makes a lot of these challenges particularly profound and is that for folks who are in a lot of challenge situations that are particularly challenging, food bank users are, for example, about 4 times more likely to have said that they don't have anyone they can rely on when they really need it. So often, folks who are from higher income brackets, when they struggle, there is someone there in their social network who has resources to help them out, or might be able to help connect them to find a job. A lot of the folks in the most vulnerable situations don't have that, which really exacerbates when things are really starting to turn into challenging situations. They don't have folks necessarily who can help them out in both in terms of having the resources or necessarily having the as broad social networks as well. So it makes these challenges even more poignant for these folks. Next slide, please. From the work side of things, we still see that workers are struggling, but I do really want to highlight like the absolutely critical improvement in unemployment. I mean, at the peak of the pandemic, we saw in May 2020, unemployment in Toronto was over 14%. In our most recent numbers, it was about 6.7%, which is only a tiny bit higher than it was right before the pandemic. I mean, when we look basically within a few years, we went back to pre-pandemic level unemployment. When we look at the 2008 recession, I mean, it took about 7 years for unemployment to hit back to where it was, particularly for folks like newcomers and particularly here, when we see the unemployment rate for newcomers, we didn't see this really long pronounced increase in unemployment for newer Canadians like we did in previous years, which I think really speaks to a lot of those challenges we spoke to in terms of the previous slide, really would be far worse in terms of if folks weren't employed. And of course, employment also is an important point of connection as well. So for folks who are unemployed, we do see a lot of really vulnerable risks around mental health, isolation, depression. And the fact that we did have such drastic improvement in unemployment so quickly really does speak to a really positive trend that I think has become so normal that we sometimes forget to appreciate. Like if that hadn't come down as quickly as it had, there would have been a lot of further ripple effects than what we've seen in terms of everything from our overall well-being to our financial security. And of course, despite all this, similar to depression, we still see these really lingering symptoms of pretty severe burnout. I mean, about almost a quarter of Torontonians were still burned out most of the time in 2023, a tiny bit of an improvement from earlier, but still, and a lot of folks are really struggling and it's really vulnerable. And that's burned out most of the time, which I mean, when you look at some of the time, like you're getting to a very substantial chunk of the population who continues to have really lingering consequences of the pandemic. And I think, when you see this far on, really slow progress, it is a sign that we might be facing some of these challenges for years to come. And of course, that is certainly connected to a lot of this connected. Like we see people are not going back to the office for a variety of reasons, but it's another way that people might have an opportunity to connect with each other in person. We talked about in our launch event for this one of the researchers from the the head of the GenWell project talked about just how important good connections, good relationships, and having a good conversation with someone from your work can have on your well-being, both immediately and for your overall health. And it can be in some cases is a much stronger relationship between how well your relationships are with your coworkers than it is with your family in terms of your overall well-being. Just because you spend so much time at work, and we see like people are not returning to the office. So one of the ways that people might reconnect is not really changing as very rapidly, despite a lot more folks are certainly starting to return to the office, but this is a very, very, very slow increase in office occupancy, even as things have unfolded. Next slide, please. Well, and there's a lot of negative indicators again, but like one of the things we do highlight as well is there are some positives, and in terms of parks, like when we compare to Canada overall, a lot more folks in Toronto had access to parks and were more likely to be using parks. Of course, we identified gaps, and like not every neighborhood has equal access to parks. Not every neighborhood has equal access to playgrounds and safe places for kids to play. And these resulted in substantial differences in outcomes across the city, where some of the neighborhoods were really not properly resources. So like we highlight a few examples of neighborhoods that haven't had enough investments in recent times in both their parks and as well as their overall play infrastructure. And like we can see real gaps in terms of how much access people had to both park usage as well as playgrounds. And there were real consequences, even as we look at the bigger picture and say there's a lot to really celebrate about Toronto's access to parks versus a lot of the country. And like when we look at the mental health benefits for folks who were connecting to those services, they were pretty substantial. So I mean, it speaks both to the positives and some of the good outcomes we got out of it, but also some of the gaps we still see in certain parts of the city. Slide, please. And similar to what we talked about in other situations, we still see transit usage well down despite our population growth. And again, this reflects just another sort of facet of the fact that people are not getting out. And the progress is really, really slow at this point. I mean, we certainly saw some pretty significant increases in some of these numbers through 2021 and through early parts of 2022. Whereas like since then, the slope of improvement has been very, very slow. For transit usage, like one of the things that's particularly makes the challenges is just how expensive it is to run a transit infrastructure. Though this is, of course, the fact that people aren't coming back has implications for folks running, community organizations and who, do charge fees, whether it's, gyms or whether it's arts and cultural activities or sports programs. I mean, whatever it is, if they're charging fees, if people aren't coming back, it makes it harder to deliver. But in the particular case around transit's concerning because we do see that as people have used stuff less, there's been cutbacks in services. It makes it harder to invest in appropriate capital improvements or new projects when you don't know if you're going to have reliable usage. So this makes, there's ripple effects in terms of people are less satisfied with the service that, say, the TTC provides. There's less pride in the TTC. So when you think about, the effort might needed to subsidize it for some time to come. I mean, when you see a pretty substantial drop in people's perceptions of the TTC, it makes it less palatable for folks to make sure that the investments are coming for years to come if transit usage remains down, particularly as the population continues to grow. I mean, it really does speak to the lower transit usage overall. Next slide, please. And when we look at our safety side of things, I mean, 2023 was quite striking in terms of the rise of major crimes. And so this chart here shows the number of major crimes over the last decade. And like you can see that 2023 really stands out as a year where we saw major crimes go up. And it was particularly driven by an increase in car thefts. And, there's been a lot of coverage on that particular topic, but certainly assaults also went up, not nearly to the same extent of car thefts, which are up hundreds of percentage points versus before the pandemic. But assaults were up about 20% plus over the course of the pandemic. And so, I mean, we are starting from a point where, a lot of crimes have been going up a little bit. And when we compare that to over to 2014, like in some cases pretty substantially. When we look at the bigger picture, the long term, I mean, crime rates are still much lower than they were, when it peaked in decades past. I mean, crime severity was about half of what it was in 1998 when we started to see pretty substantial decreases in crime. And when we compare Toronto to other cities, even with this increased crime, Toronto still does have a lower crime severity index than other major cities and other even smaller cities across the country. So there's certainly some real concerns and when we see the trajectory of this and what it might mean if it continues going forward. Same time as like there still is a point of progress when we look at the longer term. Though again, with the trends we're seeing, we are starting to lose some of that progress we had previously. And of course, with all of safety, I mean, it's also really critical to emphasize the absolute, challenges that many Torontonians face of terms of regular discrimination. We created a discrimination index, which roughly translated to when folks who are reported high levels of discrimination were experiencing multiple forms of discrimination every single week on average when we asked them about the frequency which they were experiencing discrimination. So about 27% of adults in Toronto reported experiencing frequent discrimination, and we saw a wide array of really negative outcomes. So I mean, when we talk about just the sheer number of folks who are experiencing these sorts of discrimination on a daily basis in some cases. I mean, it does really have long-term implications on their health, on their feeling of safety, and as well as their connection to the city, as well as their neighborhoods they live in. Next slide, please. And on the housing front, I mean, we really do look, the change in population over the course of the pandemic is quite striking. I mean, if you look at the national stats, you may have seen the fact that Canada grew by 1 million people for the first time ever. And, 2023 was our fastest growth year, beating the previous growth year of 2022 by a pretty sizable margin. So there's certainly a lot of new folks coming into the city with those sorts of changes. And, we don't have official population number estimates yet, but when we look at the labor force, which does estimate the size of the labor force on a monthly basis, we see about 230,000 more folks in the labor force, which is about a 14% increase versus before the pandemic. So, I mean, that's 200,000 folks who, many of them might be new to the city. Some might be returning to the labor force because of cost consequences or other things, but certainly a lot of people who need to be housed. And, construction of new builds over that time is, of course, nowhere near that number, which we also see, of course, a growing exodus from the city as many people, record numbers of folks leave the city, and particularly in the sort of the critical, young adults as, in particular children. We see like, the number of children under the age of 4 decreasing by 9% during from 2016 to 2021, as many, many folks with kids left the city. And so like that has profound implications on terms of people's social networks. And of course, even their sense of permanency of living in the city, if folks who might be considering having children in the future, seeing many of their friends leave. And that number has really surged. And of course, like you can't really talk about any of these things without just talking about just how expensive housing is in Toronto. And we have the stat there that, it takes, if minimum wage would need to be about $34 for a worker to afford a 1 bedroom. And of course, all these sorts of things, there's profound increases in overcrowding of people living in unsuitable dwellings because they need to get by, both in terms of the affordability and all these other challenges they might be facing trying to settle and live in Toronto. Next slide, please. And as we talk about so many of these challenges, and almost every challenge we talk about through this report, I think it's really worth emphasizing almost every single issue here. There's nonprofits and charities working on this. And I think it's really speaking like a lot of them are facing huge increases in demand, but they're simultaneously facing fewer donors and fewer volunteers. So when we looked at 2018 versus 2022, we asked people whether they donated or volunteered. We see in both cases they've dropped by about 12 percentage points, which translate to, I mean, about 300,000 fewer donors and about 300,000 fewer volunteers. So when we look at what the challenges nonprofits are facing, they're facing huge surges. I mean, look at those, to say, increases in food bank usage. Like those folks need to be provided services. We look at the surges in mental health. We look at the persistent challenges there and folks, needing tutoring or other educational supports, and how are we going to provide everyone the supports they need to come out of the pandemic. You're facing all of that with fewer volunteers and fewer donors than they had before, which really speaks to the real profound stretching that a lot of nonprofits are facing. Next slide, please. And when we look at it from a perspective of what the typical nonprofit says in Toronto, about 74% of them nonprofits report a surge in demand for their services, but only about 1 in 5 were able to fully meet the increased needs. So a lot of folks were seeing more and more people come through their doors for obvious reasons, and they just don't have the resources to provide what they need. And I think that gap is something that a lot of the folks on this call are here because that gap is such an important concern to you. But it is something we all need to collectively think, like, how are we going to fully resource these organizations when we see such surges in demand that really are not going away as fast as we might have hoped. And the last piece I'll say is like there is some signs of hope, and one of the things that we really do see as a positive in the course of the pandemic was like people who did participate in community activities over the course of the pandemic had much more positive outcomes. I mean, I think when you look at people who were engaging most frequently in community activities, whether it was going to the park, going to their local community center, going to their local fitness center, and a number of other sorts of key activities that people can participate in. Like people continue to do that, or at least return to those earlier, had much better mental health. And it's impossible to separate, like, if you have better mental health, you're probably much more likely to motivate yourself to go out. But also when you go to these sorts of community events and activities, you're more likely to meet your friends or meet new friends and re-engage with folks. So like it's hard to separate which was causing what and how much this is a cause or a solution. But I think a really thing is like what we're talking about with the power of us is the idea that when you connect with people, it gives you the opportunity to put on a virtuous cycle of where things get better. If you can, go to an event where you might have gone to previously and reconnect with an old friend, maybe they'll invite you to something else. Maybe you'll hear about a volunteer or donation opportunity that you wouldn't have otherwise. If you reconnect with a friend you haven't talked to in a while, maybe they'll invite you to new things. And there's so many folks who I think really struggled during the course of the pandemic and have, for a lot of reasons are struggling to re-participate even if they want to. And I think something that each of us can do is, both in terms of thinking about how you can reach out to folks you might have become disconnected from during the pandemic, or going back to activities or finding new activities, even if, it might be a bit more uncomfortable than it used to be than before the pandemic. And the more people do this, the more they'll feel connected and part of their community, the more they'll be exposed to new opportunities to get engaged. And I think this is a big theme, and Mohammed will pick it up in just a second, sort of talking about how Toronto Foundation's working on trying to take the findings and really run with them and make them as concrete as possible, and really try to move the needle on a lot of these indicators that progress has been slower than we might have hoped. Mohammed, I'll pass it on to you now to pick up. I think is a good spot to, or I guess we have Q&A first. Sorry, Mohammed, are you moderating the Q&A or am I doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Steve. I've heard you deliver this presentation a number of times, and I'm always amazed and impressed with how much you're able to capture in such a short period of time. The question and answer section on your Zoom screen should be available. So please feel free to drop in anything there. But I know one question that we constantly get whenever we produce this report is, so how do we gather this information? You pointed to a number of places where you talked about different surveys and reports. So can you walk us through a little bit around the process of producing this report?
Yeah, so there's an incredible array of information that's out there. And a big part of, you hear a 200-page report and it sounds really comprehensive till you realize there's 10 different chapters, and we're trying to really and truly explain the state of everything from work to housing to arts and culture, and give people who may not, have as much familiarity with a sense of where things are at. So we rely on so many different sources. And one of the benefits of having done this, 19 editions, is we start to know the indicators that are going to be available on an annual basis, and we go back to them. And what we do is we sort of realize, emerging issues through these conversations we do with community members. If we can't find data, we often go and look for it. And you see a lot of the surveys we referenced were us proactively going out and being like, we see that you're collecting data, on a particular topic like loneliness that we don't have a great indicator for. Would you be willing to share it with us? And a lot of great partners, ranging from folks like the Embryonics Institute and Diversity Institute, the Future Skills Center, Mental Health Research Canada, and provided us phenomenal data that allowed us to really dive into some of these things in a way that hasn't been done before in the level of the city. And then there's all sorts of things like the City of Toronto has dashboards, on food security. We see some of these ongoing reports that sort of tell us where things are going. So we often go back to the same indicators, but we also try to do a simultaneous qualitative consultation process where we hear what the issues are, and we do our best to find data sources that might tell us where things are at. And of course, when we don't have evidence, we'll often use Canada-wide data, or we'll use academic data about trying to understand some of the consequences or the cause and effects that we can't tell through point-in-time data or for program per participant data that we often get. So it is really it's a complex process, and I think part of it is we've done it enough times, both the and a lot of the team are working on the project as well as the organization more broadly. Like it allows us to filter things down, even though again it does seem like, it's quite comprehensive, but there are a ton of things that we could make this a lot longer if we wanted. And but we want to make sure anyone reading any particular chapter gets a comprehensive enough portrait that they can sort of act on it and understand where the city's going and what some of the major things that we need to focus on is.
Yeah, I know we're definitely grateful to the very many organizations that have given us access to their data, and I see some of those folks here in the group here. Um, I've got one question here, and I'll wait for others to kind of drop theirs in. But I think hearing this presentation can sometimes feel a bit heavy, and there's quite a lot to be concerned about with the city. And you've pointed to some stats that I think may cause folks to feel despair. But I also, you kind of pointed towards the latter slides around some silver lining, or at least solutions moving forward. But from your vantage point, after having gone through this process for almost a year and dug into so many different data points, what are some hopeful signs? What are some, the environment slide you pointed to sort of Toronto being a parks leader when compared to other cities in the country. Are there other kind of hopeful indicators that you are particularly struck by, positive trends?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think when we look at any of the positive trends, I mean, part of the reason, there are, Toronto continues to grow very rapidly, and we talk a lot about the challenges for sure, but it does remain a very good place to live, and there's certainly a lot of challenges that have emerged, and there's a lot of things, particularly for people settling in the city. But I mean, in any sort of comparative process, I mean, well, it still does remain a phenomenal place to live. I mean, and a lot of the sorts of challenges that come from that, including high cost of living, or shortage of spaces. I mean, it comes because people want to live here because in many ways it's such a phenomenal place to live. And we obviously cite some of the specifics, like the great access to parkland, and the all the wide array of cultural activities, and the access to various sorts of recreational and sports. I mean, and certainly a big part of the challenge right now is getting part of it is getting back to some of just part of it is, and going back to where we were 5 years ago, and part of it is recognizing that 5 years ago worked very well for some folks in the city and not as well for other folks in the city. So when we talk about, say, like how do we get indicators back, but it's also like when we look at some of the communities that might be most impacted by the pandemic, or some of the ones that might be most marginalized, how do we make sure that there is equal access? So I think like often we do take focuses of some of the parts of the city that aren't necessarily doing as well, and I think a big part of that is because there are other parts of the city that are doing particularly well. And if we wanted to pick a that was really a bit Pollyannic, we could certainly focus on some other indicators where everyone's doing well, but we often do truly try to focus on some of the things that really need improvement, which does sometimes give a negative tone, but it does also outline sort of a series of actions. Both organizations, government, and community members can figure out what in each of these areas where we need to make progress to do even better. But like even when we talk about, like, say, the TTC doing poorly, I mean, if you compare to most North American cities, the TTC is like has phenomenal coverage. And but like what we're talking about here is we need to get people back on it if we're going to maintain this coverage on the longer term, and the level of service and all these other challenges. But like it's not necessarily when we look at the challenges, it's sometimes we focus on where it needs to go, and opposed to that point of like compared to most major cities across North America, like the TTC has far wider coverage and far more for service hours, and et cetera, et cetera. Mohammed, you're on mute.
Course. Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm starting to see a number of questions come in. So I'll try to combine the first two because I think they can be answered together. And so apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. Giles or Giles has asked regarding that first stat on the slide relating to loneliness, 37% feeling lonely at least a few times a week. Is that result pretty broad across segments of the population, or are there particular groups that stand out, whether it's by age or race? Or ethnocultural communities. And related to that, Christina asks the question around, were we able to collect race-based data? So if I can ask you those two questions, are there different segments across the population in relation to the loneliness stat? And how are we able to collect race-based data?
Yeah, I mean, the great questions, both of them. I mean, I love both of those, and I mean, we certainly found some very large differences based on loneliness, and one of the most striking was based off of age. So young adults in particular, when we looked at the surveys that covered folks 18 plus, so we saw really high levels of loneliness amongst those who are let's say 18 to 34, but particularly in those sort of the younger end of those. And we saw a lot of challenges, particularly for folks with lower incomes, for people who might be from communities considered more marginalized, including the two SLGBTQ plus communities. So a lot of times where people have an existing vulnerability, we certainly saw that translated as well into loneliness. And in terms of the youth, I mean, I think that was one that was really striking, just how high that was. And a big part of the focus we had in the report is certainly on how do you get youth reconnected, and something I think we continue to focus on. And we have a webinar coming up late in February, at the end of February, talking more about how youth are doing in the city and how that's unfolded, youth and young adults. But it was certainly, I mean, the rates were extremely high, about 15 percentage points higher than the general population. And I mean, it was a theme that we was echoed as well from our 2022 social capital study, where youth were particularly likely to feel disconnected in a wide array of different ways, and trying to think about like how do you sort of get them reconnected. We also had a really large focus, and of course, in sort of youth in terms of students, like in particular high school students, where we saw some really severe outcomes. I mean, I will say, I think particularly went from when we went from virtual school back to in-person school, some of those sorts of indicators started to show an improvement, and that was a real positive sign as well. When we went looked at the data again in 2023 versus what had available for us when we wrote this report, and we're wrapping stuff up 6 or 7 months ago. So we have started to see improvement in loneliness there, which was, I mean, really a positive sign. But I think one of the things that's also really concerning, of course, is a lot of those high school students who were virtual never made friend networks while they were in high school, and they graduated out. And I think they're feeling in many ways particularly disconnected and isolated and lonely right now. And once you age out of systems, and if you're not going into say university, if you're entering the workforce potentially virtually, I mean, there's a lot fewer resources available to sort of help folks get connected into their communities than we might like. On the race-based data side, I mean, it's certainly one of the things I was really positive about folks being able to share with us survey data is we do have a lot more access to this. I mean, we highlighted a number of spots throughout the report where, like, particularly racialized folks had particularly different data points than others. And so you can certainly see more points about race-based data in the most recent report than we've had in past years. And I think as more folks are collecting this primary data, it certainly gives a lot more opportunity to do this disaggregated analysis we've never had the capability to do before. It also, unfortunately, on the flip side, is it makes it a lot more complicated to analyze any of these things, because it used to be like someone would be like, here's the number for Toronto. Now it's like, well, here's the number for Toronto for youth, or for senior, or for older adults, for people with lower income, with higher income, for 2S LGBTQ, racialized. Sometimes there'll be data for Black. So it just makes, like, when we're trying to figure out, again, like 200 pages sounds really long until you realize like every single issue can be analyzed from all these different facets, including and additional geography and all these other challenges. So like we did our best to sort of incorporate a variety of perspectives throughout the report. So there's certainly more in here than we've had in nearly any report previously.
That question around geography, or that point on geography, I think relates to a question that Aaron asked about, for in a lot of instances, we're presenting Toronto or citywide data, but recognizing there are obviously lots of outliers within neighborhoods. So whether there might be food deserts or daycare deserts, as we've referred to in previous reports, or oases, places of abundance. So I guess the question, I'll try to extend the point that Aaron was making, is that what are the kinds of data sets that are available where we can start to break down at a neighborhood level? Obviously, that's not always available, but from your knowledge, Steve, what kinds of information can be broken down at a smaller local level?
One of the things that was a motivator for Toronto Foundation to do their social capital survey, which we was published in 2022, was that survey was about 4,000 folks across the city of Toronto, and it allowed us to report with some detail out to about 11 neighborhood clusters and 26 sort of broader, areas across the city. So they're not strictly corresponding to neighborhoods, but it allows a lot more precision on everything from like questions around where is food insecurity high, or where are things where do people not have access to parks. And so you can see in the report, we did emphasize a couple of points where there are particular gaps in terms of the geographic differences. So we emphasized it when it was one of the most critical variables driving participation, or it was easy to figure out how you might be invest on it. We tried to emphasize it in the current version of the report. But it is an area like as well, like with our data set, we, as well as data sets that other folks might be collecting that can be reported in the same way, a lot more of them are open access. So I mean, it's something that I think we started working on, and I think we're sort of thinking about what's the longer term strategy, because there are different tools to sort of make that more easily available. But we are publishing a lot more on it than we used to, and we just specifically are designing the instruments to be able to report down to a local level. One of the other things in what the TDSB did with Raising the Village in terms of their census indicators, they had hundreds of thousands of folks, students report on answer their student census. So Raising the Village which is associated with the City of Toronto initiative, previously took the 2016-2017 census and broke it down on really detailed neighborhoods and sort of had a lot of stuff about like how you can sort of do that, use that information based off of how youth are doing all across the city. So there's certainly a bunch of different initiatives to sort of figure out how to use that information as effectively possible and figure out where the gaps are. I mean, but broadly speaking, having a whole bunch of these, the gaps are almost always in the same spots, which is, we see the west corner of Toronto and the northeast corner of Toronto. Like, I mean, we really see a lot of gaps there. And when we look at where people have high access to services, it's often in the higher income neighborhoods that are sort of clustered around, other parts of the city. So, like, I mean, in terms of the gaps, like we can certainly do that analysis, but we do see it is often the same places in every report that have the gaps. And we've highlighted maps showing that in the past, and unfortunately, whether it's crime rates to food insecurity to incomes to unemployment rates to poor access to transit, like it's always the same spots in the city.
Thanks. And I'll get to the question from Wayne here, who asked, in relation to the Ontario Nonprofit Network's State of the Sector report, we pulled that statistic about 70% increase in demand for services, and Wayne was asking whether if we know if there's a breakdown of that, so along specific subsectors, whether that's social services or arts or education, where does the demand come from in particular? Do you know?
Yeah, so we use as Mohammed mentioned, we use the ONN's survey from it. So a high level indicator for Toronto is there's no disaggregation of how nonprofits in Toronto are doing below that. So that's sort of with their other work they did across the entire province, they did break it down by subsector. So we see particularly with probably little surprise, like social services organizations are particularly likely to be seeing an increase in demand for services, organizations working in healthcare. And so, but I mean, it really is a bit of across the board. I mean, and you might have certain circumstances where they're different, whereas like in some of the arts and culture spaces or sports and recreation spaces, the challenges might be like, they used to charge for stuff. People aren't coming as much. They're not able to offer programs. So like their challenge might be not less like a demand and opposed to like sort of the catch 22 of, well, we can't offer our programs because we're financially where we used to be. So people are not signing up for those programs. So we can't offer more programs. So like some of those things, that's a bit of a what comes first. Whereas like obviously on when we look at these sorts of challenges, like the health and social services fields have been incredibly disrupted, and as well as in health in particular around mental health and all the consequences that come from these more severe anxiety and depressive disorders that we talk about in the report.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a question here from Julia, who who was wondering about any source of information we might have on younger children. So obviously, in most of the cases throughout the report, we're reporting on adults in Toronto, and in some instances, like the learning chapter, obviously there's where we're pulling from TDSB numbers that can account for older children, but young children, so ages 6 to 12 or so. Do we have any information either contained within the report, or do you know of other sources where we can get some insights on the impact of the post-pandemic impact on younger kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the hardest things that hint in the report is it's something we really want us to talk about. And, if we look at survey data, it's almost always 18 plus, sometimes 15 plus. At your absolute stretch, it might be 12 plus, but nobody really spends a lot of time surveying that group, and the parents of that group even are difficult to reach. So, like, it's a major gap. We will say that we tried to highlight whenever we could, and a couple spots we were able to get information are things like standardized test scores. So we have a chart near the end of the learning chapter highlighting what the standardized test scores were, and we do see, like, particularly for younger students, we see really large learning gaps emerging as those folks are coming in with fewer sort of skills and a bit of developmental delays sometimes versus students who might have been a bit younger than them. So depending on uh, TDSB does survey the parents of children those age as part of their student census. So there's certain flaws in terms of how when parents are entering in terms of what that might perceptions versus the reality, but it's certainly a very useful point to start when you're making comparisons. And I think on an international basis we're starting to see a bit more studies in terms of various types of learning outcomes and how they vary based on everything from like um, individual circumstances. And then, sometimes we'll look at things like, when TDSB publishes more detailed data, like how many people, like, in those age categories among parents say they have access to like after school, like programs or things like that. So, in terms of what the current situation is, sometimes there's gaps because it's always one of the hardest things to get at. But there are a couple things, particularly in the learning chapter, I suggest looking at. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very challenging. If you have any specific questions, I mean, do feel free to email me and happy to send you like links to any of those specific sources I mentioned, as well as some of the other things that we didn't include for a variety of reasons that might be from other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna send folks in a follow-up email an email to direct any further questions. But Mike also asks relating to whether some of the findings here in the Toronto report cross over, if there are if there are similarities in other large municipalities across the country. And here I might, and this may be where you were going, Steve, is the National Social Capital Study report that we produced in 2022. But beyond that social capital study, are you aware of any other kind of larger trends that Toronto is sort of falling in line with other big cities, or are there points where we are very much an outlier?
Yeah, so and there's a question about Canadian jurisdictions or
Canadian, yeah.
okay. Yeah, so in a couple spots in the report, we both compare to other Canadian jurisdictions as well as to various cities across, particularly the US is sort of the most easy comparator that we're sometimes will make. And you can see we do highlight, there's a few things in particular that are strikingly challenging about Toronto. And we start with the point about isolation. I mean, earlier in the pandemic, we saw some pretty striking differences in mental health in terms of mental health challenges were also a bit higher. They've improved slightly in Toronto. I mean, not a huge amount, but and they've gotten slightly worse than the rest of the country. So it has ended up with like, they're kind of converging to a very, about 25% of folks having significant mental health challenges, whereas earlier in the pandemic, we saw Toronto was, higher than the rest, but unfortunately, they got closer because the rest of the country deteriorated a bit versus Toronto improving in some of the indicators. But we do see, like, for example, on transit usage, I mean, Toronto is particularly transit reliant, and we saw, folks. So that had some really severe consequences. I mean, Toronto was really, had a very central downtown area. So like when people were not going back to offices and when people were not going, doing as much recreational stuff, like it has particular challenges in a place that's heavily reliant on transit like Toronto. I mean, we talk as well about like some of the vacancy rates and actually I'm not sure if that was this report or a previous report, but we saw that vacancy rates were certainly accelerating for offices space. We're certainly accelerating faster in Toronto versus other communities. And a big part of that was these other sorts of challenges. When we look at some of the sorts of unique challenges of Toronto, of course, a lot of other places have much higher reliance on cars. So when people are really avoiding transit, like that has some real ripple effects because in their communities people are much more likely to have access to a vehicle because of other reasons. And so when people don't feel comfortable using transit, that has some whole sorts of ripple effects in terms of and of course then Toronto, like I mean, again coming back to the housing costs, I mean you can't not really talk about Toronto housing. Like it's incredibly expensive. When you look at the most expensive cities on the planet and a house price to income or a rent to income ratio, I mean we are among the highest in compared to income in the world right now. So I mean anything that comes in terms of what's going to be the consequences of people, when they don't have enough money, like food insecurity or, some, affording access to all sorts of critical services is going to be a lot worse because Toronto is a place that a bigger portion of your income is going to go towards those sorts of things. And of course, the flip side of it is, I mean, if you look at median household income in Toronto versus most of the outlying areas where rent and housing prices remain cheaper, it's not like median household income is higher in Toronto. So, I mean, you basically a much higher share of your income is going to go to housing, which means there's less money available for everything else. Which so a bunch of particular ways that Toronto is uniquely challenged during the course of the pandemic.
If I'm
And I will say
listening.
as well, like, when we compare to US jurisdictions, which is not part of the question, like we saw a lot of cases like people were more, people got back to activities, they got back to downtowns, they returned to transit faster in other jurisdictions than in Toronto, which it's also a challenge, when we look at it compared to other cities or, in the US, like Toronto has been slow to return to activities in a variety of different ways.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to just have some last few slides to share with everyone. And this is a question that I know you don't usually like answering, which is one where it requires some interpretation. As a researcher, I think you like to present the findings, but here we're asking for your opinion a little bit. So the question comes from Manal, who asks, as people become more atomized, as we talked about sort of the growing loneliness and shrinking social circles, will they look to or trust social institutions more or less? Any thoughts on that within the next minute or so?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I'm perfectly happy to speculate, but I will also say that I'm getting into speculation and opposed to evidence in some cases. But like I certainly think like when we look at sort of academic evidence more broadly, it does suggest when people are more isolated, when they're more lonely, they are more likely to, experience anxiety, which, they're going to experience less trust. They're more likely to fear, experience all sorts of negative emotions. They're less likely to feel empathy and compassion. And I think like what that means for people's relationship to our social institutions and our structures is certainly not a positive. And I think, particularly when we see over the last decade, I mean, a lot of concerns about declining trust in institutions, a lot of concerns about people's sort of disconnection and loneliness and isolation. I mean, I think it's quite likely those are, potentially both playing mutually reinforcing roles and causing each other, but also, there's other factors that are contributing to both of those. So I think a lot of these trends are certainly big picture ones that has some long-term concerns. And I think when we talk about the idea of people getting back out into community and participating in community again and volunteering, reconnecting with people in person, like part of that is like when people are feeling connected and part of the community, like some of those sorts of things will go away. So I think like there's certainly some real pressures pushing them away, but I do think the recommendations and strategies talked about in the report, if implemented, can have a real positive impact the other way.
And that's a great transition, I think to ask the right question around what are we doing looking forward, right? So there's so much information and questions I think that the report raises, and it's a matter of what we at Toronto Foundation and across the sector and other stakeholders across the city, what can we be doing to move forward? And so first, I think it's worth acknowledging we're not the only ones who've been reflecting on civic engagement in the city and some of the declining rates of participation. And so we actually established a partnership with Volunteer Toronto, who want us all to rethink the traditional notions of volunteering. VT, Volunteer Toronto, has developed some really great resources to help Torontonians figure out their options for giving back to the city. On their website, there's this really fun online assessment to help get folks started, and we'll make sure to send that up in our follow-up email. We also created a grant opportunity. I think Joshua had asked that question relating to funding opportunities. We created a granting opportunity with Volunteer Toronto to support local initiatives that encourage social connection and civic participation. And so those applications are now being reviewed, and we'll announce the winners in the next couple of months. But there is certainly something that all of you can be doing, and just about all of us. As you can see here, and we just sort of listed out just a few examples to help turn the tide of the growing kind of social disconnection. And as you can see, they don't have to be necessarily anything big. It could be, just simply organizing a meetup with friends or even strangers, getting together for a park cleanup, or even just getting together to play some pickup basketball. All these little things taken together have the potential to bring us closer together, increase our social and civic connections. On just a very personal note, my wife and I, we like to go to the theater, and we're planning to go see an upcoming show at the Soul Pepper Theater. And rather than just being a sort of a normal date night for us, we decided to make it a group affair, and we invited 3 of our other couples to come out with us. And again, these are things that maybe people are already doing, but hopefully this campaign, The Power of Us, and this message that the report's really trying to hit home is kind of really urges folks to think a little beyond your normal behaviors. So we're not asking everyone to doing anything big or bold. It could just be very small actions to really help re-engage with the city. And finally, this is my last slide here, I believe. We're almost up to an hour. So we know that without a doubt, there's the importance of social connection in our collective well-being. And so we know that each of you have a role to play in reversing some of the trends that Steve presented. So you've listened to us, and we have a few requests. Share the report findings with your network. You can find the report directly on our website at torontofoundation.ca. Help amplify the Power of Us campaign on your socials. have a look at Volunteer Toronto Civic Engagement Continuum, and see what actions you might be able to take. And finally, if you're not already following us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter, please consider doing so. And we actually have one final event, or one upcoming event, I should say, on February 27th. So if folks were really interested, there was a question relating to youth, and so we've actually got an upcoming event. And we've invited Shaniza Ali, who's the Executive Director for Youth Initiative, a grantee partner of ours, and to talk about the state of youth in the city. And so if you want to learn more, please join us for that conversation. And with that, we are up to 1 o'clock, and so we want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.